Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who joined from different corners of the world. Thank you all for joining us today to the 8th already seminar of the Embodied Cognitive Science Seminars series. The ECogS Seminar series is a monthly event with about 2 talks a month, where each session features an academic researcher introducing their work and directions they're exploring in the field. Today, we are happy to welcome 2 speakers. So the format is that we'll have a discussion after each talk, and discussion won't be recorded. So if you have any question, please raise your hand in the chat or write it in the chat box, and I will coordinate that. So now it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Sanneke de Haan. Sanneke is a professor of psychiatry and philosophy at the Erasmus University Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And she's a senior researcher at Tilburg University, also in the Netherlands. She's a philosopher and a qualitative researcher and works on topics at the intersection of philosophy and psychiatry. Her current research project is about self-illness ambiguity in patients with recurrent depressions. In her recent book, Enactive Psychiatry, that she will be talking about today, Sanneke does an amazing job of presenting one of the main puzzles of psychiatry, and that is the problem of how do you integrate all the different aspects of our life to get a clear understanding of the nature of psychiatric disorders, and how an active approach can provide adequate explanations where other currently available models fall short. So without further ado, Sanneke, thank you for joining us today, and the stage is yours.
Thanks very much, Tash, for your introduction, and thanks very much for the invitation. I'll start sharing my screen. Let's see if that works. There we go. Does it work for everyone? Yeah, I see some nodding. Yeah. Okay, so today I will talk about indeed the book Enactive Psychiatry, and I also edit this enactive ethics bit, but I must warn from the start that I edit this because it's just something that interests me and not something that I have very interesting things to say about. So it was rather that I hope to sort of maybe we could discuss this in this setting. So this is just a little warning. And if anything is unclear, or then please interrupt me. Right, so let's see if this works. No, that's strange. Oh yes, it works. Recently, really recent, this month, an overview paper was published by Richter and Dixon, who identified 34 models of mental health problems. So well, I must admit that the first thing that I thought, oh, maybe my model is in there too, but actually it wasn't. It just mentioned my book as there's always going to be new developments that we can't capture everything. So, it is quite impressive that there are so many models of mental health problems, and models of mental health problems they see as models that say something about the nature or causes of mental health problems. So 34 models, why have another one, you could ask? Or you could also be more sort of optimistic and think, well, if there's room for 34 models, there's going to be room for 35 models as well. So what the bold claim that I want to make here is that when you look at this integration problem that Tash already shortly described, so how can we relate all these different factors? Then I actually think that these models fall short in different ways. And this question of how to integrate these factors is actually also a question about what is the nature of psychiatric disorders. Yeah, let me first. So in this article, they group these 34 models. They group them according to focus on biology, focus on psychology, social models, consumer models, including recovery, neurodiversity models, and cultural models, including spiritual models. And they show how some of these models try to capture some aspects and other aspects. But I think what you can see with these models is that most of them are what I call one-sided. Maybe that sounds a bit too negative, but what I mean with that is that most of these models really point to really focus on, say, for instance, the phenomenology, or they focus on the neurobiology. And also not all of these models aim to answer this integration problem, right? So some models, like phenomenological models, have a different aim also. But still, for the integration problem, that's not helpful. Then you have reductionist models. So there's models that can be like, say, well, there may be many factors, but eventually it comes down to this one level that explains everything. There's dualist models, especially models like values-based psychiatry that try to combine facts and values. And then there are a couple of models that actually do aim to be integrative, and are integrative to some extent, but I would say not, it doesn't really work. So, and what the main models here are the biopsychosocial model and the network model. So why would an enactive approach do better? And that is, I think, because the huge majority of these models accepts or departs from a sort of traditional mind-world topology, to use this phrase from Dreyfus and, Dreyfus and, I forgot the reference, retrieving realism. It's here in my book. Well, anyway, they have this.
Taylor?
Sorry?
Taylor?
Dreyfus and, no, it's, oh, wait, I'll just, because
Dreyfus and Taylor, retrieving realism. Right?
Oh, yes, Taylor. Sorry, you're right. Thanks. Yes, you're right. Anyway, yeah. So, and I think that enactivism does offer something, well, unique and very helpful in providing a different mind world topology, and that this is going to help psychiatry with this integration problem. Yes, what I just said, use insights from enactivism to solve the integration problem with the goal to actually support a holistic practice of psychiatry by providing a theoretical foundation for it. And you could roughly say that it's similar to the biopsychosocial model, not completely, but somewhat. But that's we've added to that the existential dimension, and really important, in contrast to the biopsychosocial model, enactivism can actually help have a coherent story about this relationship. And that's what I want to talk about today, is to focus on these two bits. I'll start with coherence, and this is basically why I think thinking about psychiatry, we need an enactive model, and then the existential dimension, and that's what I think needs to be added to enactivism in order to be helpful to psychiatry. Right, and I'll start with the coherence bit, and I'll also say a bit about, I'll also react to Sean Gallagher's talk, who was on, I don't know if it was last time or the previous one, but he also talked about the integration problem. So I wanted to address some of the things that he said also about my work. Coherence. So why does this model of psychiatry needs to be enactive, I think? First thing to be said, yes, so what I just said about this mind-world topology, because we are in the ECogS seminar, I'm just going to assume that the basics of enactivism are there for people know that. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the sort of the basics of enactivism, and just go straight to the model. And then the first question, if you look at this integration problem, the first thing to argue about is already, what is it that needs to be integrated? That's already a matter of debate, right? And the second, how can it be done? So if you look at what is it that needs to be integrated, these different models will have different ideas about what would be important and what should be in there. So in my book, I argue that there are 4 main dimensions with sub-dimensions and so on. And this is somewhat, I mean, you could carve things up differently and so on, but I think that these are sort of the 4 main ones. It can be subdivided again. I'm not gonna argue for that here. If you have any questions or remarks or a criticism of that, then I'd be happy to talk about that in the discussion. But for a matter of time, I will just say, okay, I think these are important. So it's experiences, people's experiences, the physiological processes ranging from genetics to neurobiology, so really broad, social cultural factors, aspects. This is also, of course, really broad, but just the idea that people, of course, live in an environment and live in a social world, and that these things matter too. And this includes also economic factors, material factors. So economic factors like poverty, for instance. I always group that together in the social cultural, which is a bit big, of course. And then the last one, the existential dimension. And with that, I refer to people not just having experiences, but relating to their experiences. And I think that's really important in psychiatry because that's often a factor in the disorder itself, or can be part of the problem, or it can even make the problem worse. So in part of the problem, for instance, is that when you, in psychosis, for instance, but also in severe depression, there's no outside of the psychosis or the depression anymore. So you can't just think, okay, I'm just having a psychosis here, or I'm just having a depression here. No, this is the reality at that time. And maybe with some forms of depression, people can sort of know that, people can say, okay, probably this is because I'm depressed, but they can't actually sort of step out of it and reflect on it. And also matters here of shame and stigma and not seeking help because of feeling ashamed of what you experience and so on. All these ways in which how you relate to what the stance you take towards what you experience are important in psychiatry. This was really short, but so how can we do this integrating? What I see as the main point of integrating is that you do justice to the differences between, well, in this case, what I call these dimensions, and provide a clear account of how they relate and how they might affect each other also causally. And this is, so when you look at other models, so reductionist models do offer a clear account of how aspects relate and affect each other, but they don't do justice to these differences because they all say, well, in the end, it's usually neurobiology or genetics, but it can also, of course, be social. So you could also reduce everything to say to a social dimension. Whereas dualist models and it sounds a bit too derivative maybe, but what I call fake holist models, they do want to do justice to these different, or do justice to these different dimensions, but they fail to provide a clear account of how they relate. So both need to be there in order for it to work. So the biopsychosocial model is sort of the most well-known and maybe also most used integrative model. It was explicitly introduced by Engel and developed by Engel with an integrative aim. And his main sort of enemy, or the main thing that he wanted to provide was, or main thing he wanted to prevent, was this sort of really reductionist biomedical model, only focusing on the sort of biological level. And in order to sort of fight this reductionism, he really stresses we have all these levels, and each level is unique. So you see here the molecule, the cell, the nervous system, the person, the family, and all the way up to the biosphere. And he says all of these are systems with unique qualities, requiring also unique criteria for study and explanation. So you can see no reductionism, no room for reductionism here. But, and this is again what he says here, why that all of these systems have their really own unique character. And then he says these stable configurations of these systems also implies the existence of boundaries, as you can see here in all the squares, and between these organized systems. And then he says, across which material and information flow. And this is really as clear as he gets on the sort of integration bit. So how then does what happens at the level of the cell, how does that affect the person, or the other way around? So something that happens on the social, on the cultural level, how does that affect our tissue or our nervous system or us as a person, is really, really unclear. And just so, I mean, this was in the 1980s, and you can say, oh, well, surely it must be better by now. But if you look at a current, I think, oh, I didn't mention data, but I think it's 2013 or something, that the National Institute of Mental Health of the United States introduced their research domain criteria. I'm not going to get into that here, but this is basically their suggestion of, like, we have all these different layers and we have all these different aspects that are important, but do they offer an account of how they relate? Not really. The kind of thing that comes closest is actually a reductionist account that focuses on these, what you also see. Can you actually see my, I don't know, can you now see my mouse? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Focusing on this neural circuitry. So these brain circuits, that's the best you get basically from a reductionist account, that eventually what happens is in these circuits, but it's pretty vague actually. So we have, when we want to do justice to different things and heterogeneous things and with very unique qualities, then the more you stress their unicity, the more difficult it becomes to think, well, if they are so unique, how then can we imagine how they affect each other? How does that work? How should we relate these levels? Should we do that in a hierarchical way? But then reductionism is lurking in a causal way. But then we have dualist problems of, like, how can something of a different kind affect something? How can something mental affect something physical, or vice versa, or of a constitutive kind? And how is that not reductionist? Or is there maybe a combination possible? So what I think, and then here enactivism comes in basically. And enactivism, like I said, what is, I think, unique for enactivism and really helpful for psychiatry, and specifically the integration problem, is the way in which life and mind are from the start connected. So with the emergence of life, mind emerges too. And not just life and mind, but the environment is included right away, because the matter, when you say matter in specific, self-organizing organizations is alive and minded. This self-organizing organization is an organization that depends on the environment. So fundamentally depends on the environment. So you don't have just life and mind emerging together, but also included in the very heart of the theory is already the dependence on the environment and the interaction with the environment. So so here we witness, I think, a very, very coherent mind world topology. I think also personally, I think it's very convincing, but at least it offers a really different view, right, than the traditional ones. But what is important here is when you say with the emergence of life, mind emerges too, much of this thinking is thinking in terms of like with growing complexity, with a different organizational structure, different qualities emerge. And in this way, you have different qualities, so you have these differences without them being reducible to a more basic process, a more lower level process or something like that. No, from this perspective of emergence, it's the complexity of the configuration from which new features emerge without these new features being reducible to any of the components of the this organization or configuration taken on them in themselves. But then a lot hinges on this notion of emergence. And I remember when I first read this, like really long time ago as a student, and I just felt it was like a cheating word. I just thought like, yeah, and then sort of like, ooh, emergence. And I felt it was like this sort of, how do you say when you are a goochelaar? Anyway, some magician or something like, okay, and then poof, we have something else. But of course, there is huge literature on how to understand emergence. And I think for enactivism, it's really important to think about this, and it has been thought about, obviously. So yes, like I said, with emergence, we can without assuming anything supernatural, we can still understand that there are irreducible pluralist features and processes taking place. But the important thing is then how to think about this relationship of this, how to think about what happens in such a case, how to think about emergence. And in particular, so how can a different configuration of parts or processes lead to a different emerged whole with different features? This is a very crude summary. Like I said, there is a huge amount of literature on emergence and supervenience and so on. I discuss a little bit of that in my book. But something that I found really striking is that in many cases, when the relationship between part and whole, or between constituent processes and emerged processes, when it's talked about, then there is often a sort of danger lurking of reifying again this part and this whole. So there is this idea of top-down and bottom-up causality. So the parts influencing the whole and the whole influencing the parts. But the way in which it is talked about is really as if these are two separate things, whereas of course the whole consists of its parts. And even a notion of circular causality, which is used by some, I think safely call Fuchs also an activist, but it was clearly Thompson and Varela used the word circular causality. But I think that still invites too much of a, like, you have one thing influencing the other and the other influencing the one thing, and then you still get into these levels and how they relate. And I think that a very good alternative is offered for thinking about emergence, is offered by Paul Humphrey's notion of emergence as fusion. I'll say a bit more about this because Sean Gallagher criticized this in his talk. So I'll say a bit more about this. So what Paul Humphreys does is he says, we should keep in mind that the constituent parts become the newly emerged entity, which means that they no longer have an independent existence. And he also says, when you, let me just summarize it. No, I can read it. So when the emergence occurs, the lower level property instances, this is sort of technical term he uses, go out of existence in producing the higher level emergence instances. So I wouldn't want to talk about higher level, lower level, but the point here is that once this configuration, once a specific configuration is in place, you can no longer talk about these parts or these original elements as if they still are the same as when they were not part of these configurations, and they have different abilities and inabilities. They have different powers available to them. And importantly, they are no longer, they do not no longer exist as separate identities. I think a common example of this is the mentioning of the properties of iron, for instance, in blood, in our blood, I'll put it like that. Iron has different properties than outside of this configuration. And this is like a really striking, having to do with oxygen and so on. But there are, of course, more or less sort of totally opposite kind of powers, but at least you can no longer say they have exactly, probably they don't have exactly the same abilities as before. That's the whole idea. Right, so very technical, very abstract. So let's look at an example of what this then means. So the parts are fused in the whole. What does this help for this notion of emergent? How does this help with the integration problem? And I want to look specifically at a very sort of the very sort of basic mind-body problem, as it is also in psychiatry at stake, and to think about how can we think about different ways of reducing anxiety. So suppose we reduce anxiety through drug use, psychopharmaca use, or suppose we reduce anxiety by talking to a psychotherapist. How can we understand in these different cases, how can we understand the interaction between brain processes and experiences? And from a sort of, I think, first sight intuition or sort of first sight idea, I think most people would think, okay, the drugs work on your brain, and then what happens in the brain affects your experience. Whereas in psychotherapy, it's probably the other way around. So this talking affects your experience, and this somehow affects your brain. So what we want to understand then is, how do these brain processes and these experiences, how do these relate? Now, the first thing to say is that this very question, from an enactive perspective, we should already object to this trying to relate brain processes and experiential processes directly. Because from an enactive perspective, both the physiological and the experiential processes can only be understood as part of this larger person world system or organism environment system. So it's only in the context of the organism interacting with its environment that there are experiences, but also that there are these physiological processes. That's the whole point of the life-mind continuity thesis. So from an enactive perspective, it would already be objected against. So to say, you can say both of them are emergent features of organism interacting with their environment. So if you look then at what happens when you with drug use, the first thing to note is the effects of drugs is not just the effect of the drugs themselves, it's the effect of taking drugs, of the action, so to say, of taking drugs. And this is something that takes place in a larger context of there's a treatment going on, you have expectations, you have prior experiences. It's not just something that happens in the brain, but it affects the rest of the body as well. And these are normally just summed up as placebo effects. But of course, they are very real. So drug use is not something that just affects the brain. It is the action of a person in a context. And On the other side, psychotherapy affects the person as a whole and not just her experiences, as if that was something that you could sort of target in that very like, oh, I'm only going to talk about your experiences. This, of course, includes your physiology. So the whole opposition here is already a false one from an enactive perspective. And so the first thing to note here is that we should not try to seek a one-to-one causality between these neural and experiential processes. We are opposing something that is actually both part of a larger mereological configuration. And one way to put it is to say, well, we're trying to sort of compare different magnitudes, like we're putting different magnitudes in one equation. It doesn't work. You first have to convert it to a common magnitude. Okay, so that's the first thing, a first step, I think, from an enactive perspective. Still, of course, you do want to do justice to the differences. There are differences between taking a pill and going through psychotherapy, engaging in psychotherapy. These are different causal trajectories. Even in the end, both of them may improve your mood or your anxiety. It still is a different, it's in a different way and also having different effects. So we do need to do justice to that. And here, I think the important thing is to look at the notion of causality here. By the way, Tesh, can you maybe warn me when because I don't have a clock.
So you have here. 10 more minutes. Thank you.
10 minutes. Okay, thank you. Oh yeah, then I'll speed up a bit. Right. So yes. So I think and then the important thing is that so we have not this one-to-one causality between brain processes, experiences, and also importantly, when to think about even when they are in this bigger configuration, right? Like when you say they're part of this this larger person world system, then still you want to understand, okay, but how then do they affect each other? And here I want to say, well, we want to move from a linear causality, thinking about something neuronal affecting something experiential or something experiential affecting something neuronal. We don't want to get into a linear causality here because that basically doesn't make sense. And these are not different systems that can be opposed in that sense and can be sort of relate to each other in that way. As Gallagher also shortly mentioned, here I use the metaphor of a cake. To explain organizational causality. Basically, organizational causality is opposed, is a nonlinear, so dynamical causality. So it's more, if you think of the one in sort of the domino stones, like physics, this is more chemistry. And I think cakes are helpful to illustrate this because in cakes, you have these different ingredients, but the specific, so to say, powers or the specific, how do you say, eigenschap, the specific properties, so to say, of the different ingredients, they affect each other. So the yeast you use, it's the sort of the behavior, so to say, of the yeast depends on also on the amount of sugar that's in there. These ingredients really work on each other. And yet you still can't say they work on each other in a sort of domino style way, right? We mix them, and in the mix, something happens. And I'll get to Gallagher's critique in a bit because I'll get to him in a bit. So one way to think when you think about this organizational causality is how then can we still do justice to different causal trajectories? And one way in which to imagine this, or in which I think this cake metaphor can be helpful, is if you have, say you have an effect in neurons, and it affects your experiences. I mean, there can be this tweaking with drugs, for instance, and it can have an effect on your experience. how you can understand that is a sort of local to global causality. So it's comparative to, let's say, how many sugar do you put in and how does the taste of the cake as a whole change through that? And there are thresholds for this, right? So similarly to just a little bit, like a tiny bit of serotonin uptake difference, that won't be noticeable for me at an experiential level. But if there's these drugs that really tweak the level of serotonin in my brain, I am going to notice that at the experiential level. And here, this sort of organizational causality means it's not sort of like there is the sugar domino and that just hits them, the taste domino. No, by changing the amount of sugar, you are changing the cake as a whole. And whether it's noticeable at this more global level will depend on thresholds. And similarly, when you are changing something in the brain, you are changing the person world system. And whether local changes will be noticeable at a more global level will depend on certain thresholds. The other way around, so think of the case of psychotherapy, you can also affect a person on a more global level, and this includes certain effects on their brain. So again, it's not sort of I have this experience and this in turn causes something in the brain. No, I have this experience, and part of me experiencing this is that something in my brain changes. And one way to understand that again is by this cake metaphor, is like when you put a cake in the oven, it's like this sort of a global level intervention. It will affect the taste of the cake, the texture of the cake, how dry or how moist it is. And also it will not affect all local processes equally. So you might have the icing of the cake that's already burned when you put it too high, whereas it's still too moist inside. And here too, we have to keep in mind that you are affecting the cake as a whole. You can't single out, so to say, okay, now I'm doing this only to the sugar. Affecting the cake includes this effect on the texture. Right. So there is interaction between these dimensions, but not between them directly, but as part of a larger system, and not as linear causality, but as organizational causality. Yet these causal trajectories do differ, depending on how you intervene. Do you intervene more locally with drugs, or more globally with psychotherapy? And this is so local to global, global to local. This is sort of a rough way to distinguish that. So contrary to what Gallagher says, I think I mean, the whole point is rather that I do want to do justice with these differences in the dimensions, in the causal trajectories. It's just that I think we need to think of how they can affect each other. How much time do I have, Tash?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. I'll just very shortly say something about, I feel like I have to say something in return to what Sean said. So he said, well, emergence as fusion does not help because all useful distinctions disappear. In the cake, you can no longer distinguish sugar from flour. So what use is that? And when we look at psychiatry, if you can't distinguish things, we end up with a similar situation as with the reductionist model, right? If everything is the same, yeah, I mean, then clearly the integration aim has failed doing justice to the differences. And I had a bit of an email conversation with Sean about this because I couldn't watch his talk. So I was curious to know what he was going to, like, oh, you're discussing my book. That's great. But what are you going to say? And it turned out that I wrote this one sentence in my book that that's really unfortunate and that I regret now. Namely, I wrote, when I introduced Humphrey's notion of fusion, I explained this notion of emergence, and I say, well, think again of this cake. Although we started out with separate ingredients, we end up with a cake in which these elements can no longer be discerned. And this is what Gallagher rightly said, well, this is what you say here, they can no longer be discerned. So it's all fused into this whole without any distinctions. But what I should have written here, and now I have at least a chance to, in this select company, try to get this straight, is what I wanted to say, is what I wanted to point out is that these ingredients, when they are part of this configuration, they no longer are these, like Humphreys would say, they are no longer these separate identities with the same causal powers as they had before being part of the cake. Being in this configuration makes that they have different qualities in this relationship to the other ingredients. So what I said in a previous page is that the parts or processes prior to the configuration are not the same as the parts or processes after the configuration, carving out different abilities and so on. And actually, I think that I agree with Gallagher, and since that he pointed this out to me, fusion may be not a helpful notion here. So in the email exchange we had, he said maybe you should call it transformational integration or something like that. And I think, yeah, I think fusion is indeed a confusing notion here. But I don't think actually that taking this concept of emergence leads to a denial of all distinctions. On the contrary, I think. Right, so yeah, this is some critique on what Gallagher proposes, a dynamical pattern or gestalt of processes. I think in so many, I think up to a really, really, I don't know how many percent we are actually in agreement, I think. But I still think that the way in which he presents this enhanced meshed architecture, I don't have this, maybe you still have in mind sort of, he has all these aspects and then he sort of has this drawing of different aspects as a sort of taken together. I still think, oh, but there are internal relations among these aspects, right? If you talk about narrativity and you talk about reflexivity, there is a relationship between them. And maybe narrativity could be seen as part of reflexivity. And that, I think, gets lost if you just say we have all these different aspects and we use interventionism. Interventionism has no metaphysics, which is an advantage, but also a disadvantage, because it's not going to tell us whether something has a part-whole relationship, for instance. And I think you still need an account of how does it then work? How does something that happens on the level of neurobiology, how does that affect your experiences and social interactions, for instance? Okay, I'll skip this. I'm probably already on time, right? Then I just, I'll just show this graph of saying that, okay, we have all these sense-making qualities, sense-making properties, but I think we need to add that sense-making can be reflective, that we can relate to our experiences, and that this actually changes everything. And I think this picture nicely sums that up. And this changes everything in the sense that we're dealing with a different form of life. We relate to the world differently. And this is a shift, I would say, from organism environment to person world. Yeah, no, I should stop talking. Time for discussion. We can discuss existential dimension. And I already said the enactive ethics was a bit underwhelming anyway. It was rather sort of to invite discussion about that. I'll just shut up. Thank you for your attention. Sorry, that was a bit bad planned.
Thank you, Sanneke. It was a great talk. It's nice to see this ping pong conversation between you and Gallagher. And I think we all learn from it as we listen to you guys. And pause the recording now for discussion. So, okay, great. Let's thank Sanneke again. And now let's move to our next talk. Our next speaker is Cathy Macpherson. Cathy is a PhD candidate at the University of Western Australia. Her work sits at the intersection of coordination dynamics and social psychology, with a particular focus on the role of typical variation in mental health in shaping how social events unfold. Her PhD research investigates how the dynamical control parameters that underlie effective coordination are related to variation in mental health symptomology. And today she will be presenting her recent work that examines how subclinical variation in mental health traits influences the real-time dynamics that underpin interpersonal coordination. Cathy, thank you for joining us today, and take it away.
Perfect, thank you. So hopefully you can see my screen and hear me and everything like that. Yep, perfect. Yeah, so today I essentially want to talk about some of the empirical work that I've been conducting as part of my PhD, which examines the association between mental health and interpersonal coordination. So, I do want to start off by thanking Professor de Haan for a really insightful, interesting talk. My first kind of couple of introductory points provide a really brief overview of kind of some of the many approaches that Professor de Haan started by talking about. I certainly don't have, I think, all 34 models. But I'll just kind of keep this short. The idea is just to really situate some of the empirical work that I'll be discussing within a kind of wider context. So, yeah, so with that, traditional approaches to mental health, as we know, they adopt a rather reductionist, disembodied perspective, where mental health disorders are kind of conceptualized in part as problems with cognitive processing, perhaps. And as a result, the kind of dominant approach that has been taken by empirical work within this area has been to focus on the cognitive operations of an individual as the primary unit of analysis. So, of course, when we look kind of more from an embedded perspective, we can see that mental health does not just exist at this cognitive level, and instead is distributed not just across the brain and body, but also across an individual's environment, and in particular here, an environment that includes other agents. And so to properly examine this embodied embedded nature arguably means, I guess, moving away potentially from a focus just on cognitive operation and towards instead a unit of analysis that kind of captures the interaction between a person and their environment, or perhaps even between the interactions, between kind of a person and other people. And of course, this comes with quite the challenge, right, in terms of how to capture this interaction. And I think one way to do this is to study how people coordinate, because coordination is a relational property. So I want to give a kind of little introduction into interpersonal coordination, I guess. It forms the basis of a lot of the empirical work I'll talk about today. And it really is a very integral part of social exchange. So to interact effectively, we need to coordinate with others. And so, for example, to converse effectively, we need to coordinate or align speech patterns, intentions, locations over Zoom or in person, and so much more. And perhaps unsurprisingly, in the wider literature, when we look at research examining interpersonal coordination, we find that it has this kind of bidirectional relationship with a range of social outcomes, including increased bonding and rapport. However, for individuals who experience certain mental health disorders, the research also suggests that this ability to coordinate effectively with others may be undermined. And as a result, they might not enjoy kind of the social benefits that coordination brings. And one example that I want to highlight here is a paper by Varley and colleagues who considered the influence of social anxiety disorder on coordination. They asked their participants to perform a really simple pendulum swinging coordination task. And what they noted was decreased stability in coordination where the dyad contained an individual diagnosed with social anxiety in comparison to a dyad who did not contain an individual diagnosed with social anxiety. And this finding, it's not just in social anxiety, we also see it across literature regarding autism as well as schizophrenia. So the last kind of points that I want to talk about as part of the introduction is that in a lot of the research on interpersonal coordination, a lot of the focus has been on a specific form of coordination termed interpersonal synchrony, which is where people or oscillators, they match their movements in time and space. And this form of coordination, it does not just emerge kind of intentionally. So when we say, oh, we will synchronize our movements when dancing or in synchronous swimming, but also unintentionally. So for example, if we are walking down the street with someone else, we may begin to unintentionally or spontaneously synchronize our footsteps. And from a research perspective, there is an advantage to examining this form of coordination in that it has been modeled mathematically using the HKB equation. And this essentially states that for coordination to emerge between two oscillators, so oscillating limbs, for example, when walking, they need to be exhibiting similarities in movement frequency, as well as some form of coupling. So in interpersonal coordination, for example, that may be a visual coupling or a tactile coupling or auditory. And in addition, the equation we have here, it contains the term for stochastic noise, which essentially is included to deal with kind of microscopically generated fluctuations of the oscillators. So the last thing I want to say is that when coordination emerges, it typically falls into one of two stable modes, either in phase, where the oscillators are moving at the same time or going in the same way as each other, and anti-phase, where they move in opposite directions. So what I will do now is just begin to kind of talk about some of the empirical work that I've been conducting that uses essentially this approach to examine the relationship between mental health and coordinated behavior. So what we started off by doing is conducting essentially a conceptual replication and extension of the paper by Farley and colleagues that had looked at social anxiety. And we did make one notable difference here. So in contrast to the previous research, we chose not to take a clinical sample, but instead we adopted a continuum approach whereby we essentially measured typical variation in psychopathological qualities across our sample. And I'll explain how we did that in a second. And in terms of the task, much like Farley and colleagues, we asked our participants to perform a really simple pendulum swinging task. They're simply asked to swing a weighted pendulum in time with their partner. And I have a picture of the task there that unfortunately includes a picture of myself, so that you can see essentially what participants did. And during this task, we were able to capture the essentially moment-to-moment coordination of our participants via a magnetic motion tracking system, where we placed sensors at the end of each pendulum. And then to come back to our typical variation in mental health, we essentially asked participants to complete a range of questionnaires across symptomologies that we had I guess selected based on the previous literature. So we included a measure of social anxiety, autistic traits, as well as kind of state trait anxiety and depression. All right, so what did we find? Well, what we found essentially replicates Farley and colleagues' findings. So I have the graph on the screen, and here we have coordination stability, where lower numbers indicate more stable coordination. So coordination stability at the side, and then I have a graph for each of our measures, and perhaps you can see my pointer, I'm not sure, along the bottom. And our findings essentially indicate that higher levels of mental health symptoms were associated with less stable coordination. And we found this pattern across each of our measures, with the exception being depression. So we don't find any significant relationship with our depression measure and coordination stability here. So from here, we started to run a follow-up study. This study is a registered report. It has an in-principle acceptance at JASP. So I don't actually have any results yet because we are still about halfway through running the study. But I wanted to put this up anyway because I wanted to give a bit of an overview of some of the questions that we are asking kind of moving forward. So really the purpose of this study is to investigate the extent to which mental health relates not only just to the overall patterning and stability of coordination, which we considered in study 1, but also to the key dynamical control parameters that govern coordination. And I have the equation back up there to kind of point those out. And we intend to, or we've attempted to do this through pendulum swinging design, but with a kind of methodological and analytical extension from the previous study. So methodologically, this time we decided to systematically vary essentially the sociality of the task. So the participants start the task by performing the pendulum swinging solo at a comfortable pace. They are then asked to match their movements with a digital pendulum. They then complete these trials again whilst they are observed by their interaction partner. And then finally, they do the interactive portion of the task. So they perform the pendulum swinging together. And additionally, in terms of the analytical side, we plan to employ techniques that will provide essentially insight into the parameters set out in the HKB equation. So specifically, we will employ kind of cross-spectral coherence to provide insight into our frequency matching parameter, as well as measures of cross-recurrence to provide insight into the coupling strength and the noise of the system. And from here, we can, of course, examine the relationship between these and our mental health measures, which are similar to the previous study. Okay, so the previous set of experiments, they obviously comprise 2 individuals. They come into the lab, and each of those individuals comes with their own, I guess, level or kind of cluster of psychopathological qualities. So for example, their own levels of social anxiety. And of course, the likelihood is that these interact in complex ways. And from an experimental perspective, it means that we lose some experimental control in this context. And so the next set of experiments that I want to discuss, they use virtual reality to allow us to examine, again, this relationship between mental health and coordination, but in a more controlled environment. Okay, so for our first VR study, we essentially conducted an experiment where we asked individuals to come in and again perform a coordination task. This time they perform a very simple arm curl movement with an avatar who they are told this is a real participant who you will meet later. But in reality, the avatar is pre-programmed. There is no real participant. And the participants, they engage in 2 movement trials with the avatar. So in the first movement trial, we asked them to move just at a comfortable pace, designed for us to be able to look at the emergence of spontaneous coordination. And for the second trial, we asked them to explicitly move in time with the avatar's movements. And so one of the benefits of virtual reality, of course, is that it allows us to manipulate the actions of our avatar in a way that we can never do when we take people into the lab. And so here we randomly assigned participants to interact with an avatar who either exhibited a direct gaze pattern, so she looks at you for the duration of the interaction, or an avatar who averted her gaze for the duration of the interaction. And this was designed essentially as a kind of manipulation of social intention or attention, a very kind of important salient factor in many mental health disorders. And just as with the pendulum swinging study, we were able to capture moment-to-moment coordination in real time using the motion tracking system that is inbuilt into the VR system that we use. And again, we ask participants to complete a range of questionnaires designed to kind of quantify these psychopathological qualities. All right, so in terms of the results for this study, here I have again plotted coordination stability up the side of the graph, but just to confuse everyone, we've used a slightly different metric. And so here the lower numbers, they correspond with less stable coordination. So the opposite of what we saw with the pendulum swinging. And the first thing I want to note is that for the coordination patterns, we have spontaneous coordination in the first column and then intentional coordination in the second. And what we see really replicates the patterns that we find outside of VR, where the spontaneous coordination emerges, but intentional coordination is much more stable. And then in terms of our interaction, or sorry, the eye gaze, we see an interaction between coordination and eye gaze, where in the spontaneous condition, we have a higher degree of stability when the avatar gaze is direct. So when she looks at you, participants, what emerged was a higher degree of coordination stability than when the avatar averted her gaze. Now, in terms of the mental health, what I want to focus on is social anxiety here, because the results were pretty interesting. And I'd be curious to hear kind of people's thoughts on this at the end. So this is the spontaneous coordination graph. And here we see that coordination stability actually increased with increasing levels of social anxiety, but only when the avatar averted her gaze. And we see a similar pattern of results in the intentional condition as well, albeit they're not quite as obvious there. And of course, this really flips from the first set of studies and indeed the previous literature. Typically, the relationship reported between social anxiety and stability of coordination is negative, with individuals showing less stable patterns. And here we show the reverse, but of course, no other study has examined the gaze patterns of the interaction partner, which looks to have essentially played a bit of a key role here. So of course, this was surprising, but it did potentially support kind of more traditional literature to suggest that individuals with higher levels of social anxiety show perhaps an attentional bias towards negative social information. And whether or not this is the case, we did wonder whether gaze aversion may provide some sort of opportunity to look at the avatar for longer, and in turn, essentially enhance the coupling required to maintain stable coordination. And so we really want to examine this. We're in the process of conducting a bit of a follow-up study that uses a similar methodology, but which will use eye tracking to measure the attentional patterns of the participant there as well. Okay, so I think I'm pretty much running on time, I hope. I just have a kind of conclusion to give, and then I'm pretty much done. But I think, taken together, we see a kind of replication of findings in the pendulum study from the clinical literature, in which we see a disruption of coordination as a function of psychopathological traits, even when we consider the variation in mental health across the population. And this is rather consistent with the conceptualization of mental health as a kind of embodied signature, or of coordination as an embodied signature of mental health. And further, we seem to have identified a kind of socially relevant behavior that may lead to reductions in this impairment in synchrony associated specifically with social anxiety. And I think, this is quite preliminary, but at some point it may provide some direction for the development of potential intervention there. And yes, so taken together, I think these findings, they support the claim that mental health symptoms are very much distributed across our social interaction. Yeah, so that is everything. Thank you for your attention, and I'm excited to have a conversation about some of this stuff.